Fellow wanderers of Middle-earth, gather close as we venture into the halls of kings, where power transforms those who wield it in ways both expected and surprising. Tonight we follow Aragorn through his first tender months as King of Gondor, watching how a man accustomed to sleeping beneath stars learns to find rest in chambers built for sovereignty. How hands that once gripped sword hilts must learn the different strength required to hold the trust of an entire people. The first sensation that greets him each dawn in the royal chambers is silence deeper than any he experienced during decades of ranging through wild places, where danger required constant vigilance. No bird calls penetrate walls built to withstand siege. No wind rustles through trees that might hide approaching enemies. Instead, his awakening comes wrapped in the profound quiet of stone halls, where generations of kings have risen to face the particular burdens that only crown-bearers can fully understand. The bed beneath him stretches wider than seemed possible after years of sleeping on hard ground with cloak for blanket and saddle for pillow. Silk sheets that would have seemed impossibly luxurious during his ranger days now feel somehow constricting, their smoothness unfamiliar against skin accustomed to rougher textures that spoke of honest travel and necessary hardship. The mattress yields to his weight with softness that promises comfort yet somehow fails to deliver the deep rest that once came naturally after days spent walking paths that led toward purposes clear and immediate. Sunlight enters through windows designed by craftsmen who understood how morning illumination should fall across rooms, where momentous decisions take shape through quiet contemplation. The light carries different quality than the raw sunshine that once woke him in places where survival depended on reading weather and landscape for signs of opportunity or threat. Here, filtered through glass and colored by tapestries that tell stories of ancient victories. Dawn arrives, gentled and refined, beauty that speaks to civilization's triumph over chaos. The clothes that await his attention each morning represent their own form of burden. Garments cut from fabric, fine enough to honor the office, while substantial enough to bear the weight of ceremony and expectation. The simple leather and wool that served him well during his wandering years hang in a wardrobe beside robes of state that transform his body into symbol of authority that extends far beyond individual will or preference. Each morning brings the conscious choice to clothe himself in responsibility that grows heavier with understanding of how many lives depend on decisions made by whoever wears such magnificent burden. The mirror that reflects his face shows features marked by experiences that no amount of royal privilege can erase. Lines carved by years of exposure to elements and hardship that taught lessons about leadership, through example rather than decree. The crown that will soon rest upon his brow serves as daily reminder that power earned through trial differs fundamentally from authority inherited through bloodline. That the trust placed in his hands comes weighted with knowledge of what price others paid to place it there. Moving through chambers that echo with footsteps of previous kings who faced their own unique challenges during ages, when different forms of darkness threatened what they held dear. Aragorn feels the profound shift that has occurred in his relationship to solitude and responsibility. The freedom of the road has been exchanged for the deeper satisfaction that comes from serving purposes larger than individual adventure. Yet the exchange carries its own forms of grief for simplicities that can never be recovered once left behind. The day stretches ahead filled with obligations that will teach him new forms of courage. strength measured not in sword strokes, but in wisdom applied to problems that affect thousands. The throne room where Aragorn holds court each morning fills with voices that speak in careful phrases designed to conceal as much as they reveal. Language shaped by generations of nobles who have learned to navigate power through indirection and diplomatic courtesy. The petitioners who approach his seat of judgment carry concerns that require solutions more complex than any problem he faced during his years of ranging. Disputes that involve not just individual grievance, but intricate webs of law and precedent that stretch back through centuries of accumulated tradition. The advisors who surround him offer counsel filtered through their own understanding of how kingdoms function. Wisdom earned through lifetimes spent in halls, where decisions emerge through consensus, rather than the immediate clarity that once guided his choices when survival demanded swift action. Their deliberations unfold with patience that sometimes tests his tolerance for process. Discussions that examine every angle of problems that his ranger instincts suggest could be solved through more direct approach. The documents that require his attention arrive each day in carefully organized stacks, each parchment representing someone's hopes or fears translated into formal language that reduces human complexity. Two categories that can be filed and referenced according to established procedure. Trade agreements that will affect merchant families for generations. Judicial appeals that carry the weight of lives hanging in balance. Diplomatic correspondence that must be crafted to preserve delicate relationships between kingdoms whose histories include both alliance and conflict. His signature carries power that still amazes him with its reach. Simple marks that can authorize the movement of armies or the distribution of resources sufficient to feed entire cities. The ink that flows from his pen transforms intentions into commands that will be carried to distant provinces by messengers who ride with authority that derives entirely from symbols, written by hand that once gripped nothing more significant than sword, hilt, and walking staff. The complexity of governing reveals itself through problems that resist the straightforward solutions his wilderness experience taught him to prefer. A dispute between farming communities over water rights involves not just immediate need, but historical claims, seasonal patterns, legal precedents, and political relationships that connect to larger questions about how resources should be distributed. When abundance cannot satisfy every legitimate demand, the petitioners who seek his judgment arrive carrying burdens that cannot be lifted through individual acts of heroism, sorrows that require systemic solutions rather than dramatic gestures. Widows whose husbands died in recent wars need not just compensation, but assurance that their children will have opportunities to build meaningful lives. Veterans whose bodies bear wounds that will never fully heal require support that extends beyond immediate medical care to encompass dignity and purpose that can sustain them through decades of limitation. The delicate balance between justice and mercy proves more challenging in practice than in principle. Situations that demand wisdom about when rigid application of law serves the greater good and when circumstances call for flexibility that honors both letter and spirit of traditional justice. Each decision creates precedents that will influence how similar cases are handled in future. Responsibility that extends far beyond immediate satisfaction of current disputes. The loneliness that accompanies authority becomes more apparent as days pass, and he realizes how rarely anyone approaches him without agenda. How seldom conversations arise from simple desire for companionship, rather than need to influence decisions or gain favor. The honest fellowship he once shared with rangers who spoke their minds, without calculation for political advantage, seems precious beyond measure when viewed from throne. The hours after midnight offer Aragorn the only time when Minas Tirith truly belongs to him rather than to the crown he wears. When stone streets empty of petitioners and courtiers provide sanctuary, where he can walk without ceremony or the constant awareness that every gesture carries meaning beyond its immediate purpose. These solitary wanderings through his sleeping capital become the most precious part of each day, moments when kingship transforms from burden into something approaching benediction through direct connection to the people whose welfare gives meaning to all his other responsibilities. The guards who would normally accompany any royal movement receive gentle dismissal during these nocturnal journeys, their protests overcome by his quiet insistence that some forms of understanding can only be achieved through solitude. The freedom to move through familiar passages without escort restores something essential that daylight hours of formal obligation gradually erode: connection to the simple pleasure of walking that sustained him through years when the road itself served as home and destination. The upper circles of the city sleep with the quiet confidence of those who trust in protection they rarely see but always feel. Windows dark behind shutters that frame dreams undisturbed by worry about external threats or internal discord. Aragorn passes these peaceful homes with satisfaction deeper than any he experienced. During his ranging years, knowledge that his presence in the royal chambers above allows countless families to rest without fear, children to sleep without nightmares about enemies approaching through darkness. The middle circles buzz with subdued activity as bakers begin early preparations for morning bread. Blacksmiths bank fires that will roar to life with dawn. Innkeepers serve late travelers who arrive seeking shelter after long journeys. These honest workers acknowledge his passage with respectful nods that carry none of the formal genuflection required during official appearances. Simple recognition that speaks to relationship between ruler and ruled based on mutual service rather than distant hierarchy. The lower circles tell different stories through sounds that drift from windows, where poverty makes sleep fitful and uncertain, where illness or unemployment create anxieties that no royal decree can immediately resolve. These neighborhoods remind him why kingship must extend beyond ceremony and grand gesture to encompass daily attention to problems that affect people whose names will never appear in official chronicles, but whose welfare measures the true success of any reign. The fountain in the court of the kings provides his favorite resting place during these midnight rambles, its gentle splash creating music that speaks to continuity stretching back through generations of rulers who faced their own unique challenges, yet somehow maintained the essential framework that allows civilization to flourish. The water flows as it has for centuries, indifferent to political upheaval, yet somehow connected to deeper rhythms that sustain hope through periods when surface events suggest reason for despair. Sitting on stone benches where countless previous monarchs have sought similar solitude, Aragorn finds perspective that daylight hours of immediate crisis and urgent decision make difficult to maintain. The problems that loom so large during council meetings shrink to manageable proportions when viewed against the patient endurance of stone and water. the accumulated wisdom of trees that have weathered storms, more violent than any political tempest. The city spreads below him in these quiet hours like a map of all the lives that his choices will touch. Streets that connect individual stories into larger narrative about what becomes possible when leadership serves love rather than ambition, when power flows toward protection rather than domination. The peace that settles over Minas Tirith during these midnight hours speaks to deeper peace that he works to cultivate through decisions made in council chambers far from these streets, where their effects will ultimately be measured. The quiet moments between audiences and council meetings bring unexpected visitations. From memories that surface without invitation, fragments of his ranging years that arrive carrying wisdom he had not recognized. When first living through experiences that seemed merely practical necessity, rather than preparation for challenges that would demand different forms of courage and understanding. Sitting in alcoves between formal chambers, Aragorn discovers how deeply his years in the wild shaped his approach to problems that seemed to require entirely different solutions, yet respond to principles learned beside campfires and along lonely paths. Elrond's voice echoes through decisions that involve diplomatic complexity far removed from the simple choices that once faced him as Strider moving through territories where friend and foe could be distinguished through direct observation, rather than careful analysis of motivation hidden beneath layers of courtesy and political calculation. The patient wisdom that the Lord of Rivendell demonstrated during countless conversations beside library fires now reveals its deeper applications as Aragorn learns to listen for truth beneath surface statements, to hear what petitioners cannot quite bring themselves to say directly. The lessons about reading landscape for signs of danger or opportunity prove surprisingly relevant when applied to the shifting terrain of court politics, where alliances form and dissolve according to patterns, as predictable as weather changes for those who learn to recognize the subtle indicators that precede larger transformations. His ability to track quarry through difficult terrain translates into skill at following complex negotiations toward conclusions that serve justice rather than merely satisfying the loudest voices or most persistent pressure. The discipline of moving silently through hostile territory finds new expression in his approach to problems that require careful investigation before action, situations where premature intervention might cause more harm than patient observation followed by precisely targeted response. The same attention to detail that once meant survival in places where single mistake could prove fatal now serves him well when navigating disputes, where hasty judgment might create lasting damage to relationships essential for maintaining peace. The ranger's understanding of how small actions can have large consequences over time informs his approach to seemingly minor decisions that will establish precedents affecting how future problems are addressed. Throughout his reign, his experience with how tiny changes in environment can alter animal behavior helps him recognize how small adjustments in policy or procedure might encourage desired changes in behavior without requiring dramatic interventions that could create resistance or unintended complications. The nights spent watching over sleeping settlements from hidden positions taught him about protection that works best when those being guarded remain unaware of threats being managed beyond their perception. Knowledge that serves him well as he learns to address problems before they reach crisis proportions rather than waiting for situations, to demand emergency measures that might have been avoided through earlier attention. The brotherhood he shared with fellow rangers who trusted each other completely, because survival depended on such trust, becomes model for the relationships he seeks to build with advisors, whose loyalty must be earned through demonstrated competence and genuine care for the common good, rather than extracted through intimidation or purchased through favor and preferment. The simple meals shared around campfires where honest conversation flourished, because pretense served no useful purpose, inspire. His efforts to create spaces within the formal structure of court where truth can be spoken without fear of political consequences, where problems can be discussed according to their actual importance, rather than their potential for advancing individual careers or settling old scores. The portraits that line the corridors of the royal quarters gaze down at Aragorn, with eyes that seem to carry judgment and expectation in equal measure. Faces of kings whose reigns shaped Gondor through centuries of triumph and trial that left legacies he must somehow honor, while forging his own path through challenges they could never have anticipated. Each morning's walk past these painted monarchs brings reminders of the weight that accompanies any attempt to live up to bloodline that includes both heroes whose names inspire hope and failures whose mistakes still echo through current problems requiring solutions. Isildur's story haunts him most persistently, not because the ancient king's moment of weakness at Mount Doom brought catastrophe that shaped all subsequent history, but because Aragorn recognizes in that failure the same human frailty that could lead any ruler toward choices that seem reasonable in isolation, yet prove disastrous when viewed through the lens of larger consequence. The temptation to grasp power beyond what wisdom suggests carries echoes through every decision that involves choosing between immediate advantage and long-term welfare of people whose trust must be earned fresh each day. The crown itself bears engravings that tell stories of previous wearers, who faced invasions and plagues, civil wars and natural disasters that tested their ability to lead when leadership required sacrifices that personal preference would never have chosen willingly. Reading these histories carved in precious metal teaches him about the loneliness that accompanies ultimate responsibility, the isolation that emerges when every choice affects thousands of lives and mistakes cannot be corrected through simple apology or renewed effort. The expectations that surround his reign carry weight that extends far beyond the borders of Gondor, to encompass hopes harbored by peoples throughout Middle-earth, who look to his example for evidence that the Age of Shadow has truly ended, and lasting peace might finally be possible. Letters arrive from distant kingdoms, whose rulers seek guidance about their own struggles with rebuilding after years of war. Their correspondence revealing how much his success or failure will influence whether recovery spreads throughout the known world. The advisors who served previous kings bring counsel shaped by decades of observing how royal decisions create consequences that unfold across generations. Their wisdom earned through witnessing both the gradual improvements that result from patient attention to detail and the sudden crises that emerge when momentary inattention allows small problems to grow beyond easy solution. Their perspective helps him understand how current choices will appear to historians who judge reigns by their ultimate effect on the welfare of ordinary citizens. The nobles whose families have held positions of influence, for centuries watch his innovations with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Their support essential yet conditional upon his ability to balance necessary change with respect for traditions that have provided stability through previous upheavals. Navigating their expectations requires diplomatic skill that his ranger years never demanded. Understanding of how to introduce reforms without triggering resistance that could undermine progress. The common people whose welfare provides the ultimate measure of any reign bring their own forms of pressure, through hopes that peace will bring not just safety but prosperity, opportunities for their children to build better lives than previous generations could achieve during years when survival consumed energy that might otherwise have been devoted to growth and improvement. Their faith in his ability to deliver such improvements carries both inspiration and burden that shapes every policy decision. The legacy he hopes to leave involves not just preservation of what previous kings achieved, but expansion of possibilities for human flourishing that could serve as foundation for centuries of continued progress toward justice and abundance for all. The true education in kingship begins not in council chambers, where formal protocol governs every exchange, but during visits to workshops and markets where Aragorn learns to navigate conversations that flow according to the natural rhythms of people absorbed in honest work, rather than shaped by careful consideration of political advantage. These encounters teach him that effective leadership emerges through understanding gained from listening rather than authority exercised through commanding, wisdom that develops through patient attentio, and to how his decisions affect lives measured in daily bread and seasonal harvest. The blacksmiths who hammer metal into tools that will serve farmers and craftsmen throughout the kingdom speak with directness that cuts through diplomatic language to reveal practical concerns that never surface during formal audiences. Their calloused hands gesture toward problems that require solutions grounded in understanding of how things actually work, rather than how they appear in reports filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy. Watching them shape iron through patient application of heat and pressure teaches him about leadership that transforms through persistent effort rather than dramatic gesture. The merchants whose stalls fill market squares with goods from distant provinces share stories about trade routes and seasonal variations that affect prosperity in ways that no amount of theoretical knowledge could convey. Their concerns about fair taxation and protection from bandits reveal how royal policies translate into real consequences for families whose welfare depends on successful commerce. Their practical wisdom about human nature helps him understand how to structure laws that work with rather than against normal tendencies towards self-interest and mutual benefit. The farmers whose labor feeds the city arrive with earth still clinging to boots that have walked furrows since before dawn, their weathered faces carrying knowledge about soil and climate that shapes abundance or scarcity according to patterns that extend far beyond any single growing season. Their patient explanations about crop rotation and water management provide education in stewardship that applies to governing people as surely as it serves cultivation of grain. Understanding that sustainable prosperity requires attention to long-term health rather than short-term yield. The craftsmen whose workshops produce furniture and clothing, pottery and tools that furnish daily life throughout Gondor demonstrate mastery earned through years of refining technique until skill becomes second nature. Their devotion to quality that will serve customers long after initial purchase teaches him about leadership that builds trust through consistent performance, rather than impressive promises that might fail when tested by normal use and passage of time. The mothers who balance children on hips while conducting business reveal how ordinary heroism manifests through countless small acts of nurturing and protection that receive no recognition yet sustain civilization more surely than any military victory. Their ability to manage multiple concerns simultaneously while maintaining patience and good humor provides model for royal attention that must encompass competing demands without losing sight of fundamental priorities. The elderly citizens whose memories stretch back through previous reigns offer perspective that helps him distinguish between problems that require immediate attention and others that represent normal variations in human experience rather than crises demanding dramatic intervention. Their stories about how previous policies affected their families over decades provide guidance about consequences that extend far beyond initial implementation of new laws or procedures. The children whose laughter brightens every encounter remind him that the ultimate purpose of good governance involves creating conditions where innocence can flourish, without being crushed by premature exposure to difficulties that adults must handle on their behalf. Their spontaneous joy becomes measure of success that transcends any formal evaluation of policy effectiveness. The restlessness that stirs within Aragorn during moments of enforced stillness speaks to something deeper than mere preference for movement over stability, representing instead the fundamental tension between a nature shaped by decades of wandering and responsibilities that require him to remain rooted in place where others can find him when guidance becomes necessary. The throne that anchors him to Minas Tirith feels sometimes like benevolent imprisonment, golden chains that bind him to purposes larger than individual desire, yet constrain the spirit that once found freedom in paths that led toward horizons unlimited by duty or expectation. The maps that cover his study walls provide insufficient substitute for the direct knowledge that comes from walking territories they represent, abstract representations that reduce living landscapes to symbols that cannot convey the scent of morning air or the particular quality of light that reveals whether rain approaches from distant mountains. His fingers trace routes through regions he explored during his ranging years, memories more vivid than any painted representation could achieve, yet somehow less satisfying than the immediate experience of ground beneath his feet and sky overhead without barriers. The reports that arrive from rangers still patrolling borders between wilderness and civilization carry news that awakens longing for the clarity that emerges when purpose aligns perfectly with action, when problems can be solved through direct intervention, rather than careful consideration of multiple competing interests that must be balanced against each other. Their accounts of tracking bandits through forest paths or protecting travelers from creatures that threaten isolated settlements remind him of satisfaction that comes from challenges that yield to individual skill and determination, yet gradually, through seasons of learning, to find meaning in different forms of service. Aragorn discovers that adventure exists wherever consciousness chooses to recognize it, that building something worthwhile proves no less demanding than any quest he undertook. During his years of seeking rather than settling, The complexity of weaving individual lives into patterns that serve collective flourishing requires skills that his wandering years taught him to value. Patience learned through tracking quarry across difficult terrain now applied to following problems through bureaucratic mazes toward solutions that honor justice. The courage demanded by daily governance differs fundamentally from bravery required during moments of physical danger, calling instead for willingness to make decisions whose consequences will unfold across years rather than hours, to accept responsibility for outcomes that depend on factors beyond any individual control. This steadier form of heroism proves more challenging in ways that surprise him, requiring strength that sustains itself through repetition, rather than rising to meet single moments of crisis that pass quickly regardless of their intensity. The satisfaction he discovers in watching projects develop through stages that stretch across seasons teaches him about different rewards available to consciousness willing to invest attention in processes that mature slowly rather than seeking gratification through immediate results. The aqueducts that will carry fresh water to neighborhoods that have struggled with inadequate supply, the schools that will educate children whose parents never learned to read, the hospitals that will heal wounds, both visible and hidden, represent adventures in human possibility rather than geographical exploration. The kingdom itself becomes territory to be explored through understanding rather than crossed through physical movement. Each district offering mysteries about how people organize their lives around different priorities and possibilities. The nobility of purpose that once drove him toward distant dangers now finds expression through commitment to remaining present, where his unique combination of experience and authority can serve needs that would otherwise go unmet. The private chambers that Aragorn shares with Arwen become sanctuary where the weight of kingship lifts from shoulders that have carried responsibility. Throughout daylight hours spent mediating disputes and making decisions that will echo through generations yet unborn. Here, behind doors that close against the constant stream of petitioners and advisors, he rediscovers the man who exists independently of crown and ceremony, consciousness freed from the careful calculation required when every word carries political consequence, and every gesture might be interpreted as signal of royal intention or preference. Arwen's presence transforms rooms that might otherwise feel like beautiful prison into haven where silence speaks more eloquently than any formal conversation, where understanding flows between hearts that have learned to recognize each other's needs, without requiring explanation or elaborate expression of feeling. Her attention provides the particular form of recognition that reminds him who he was before circumstance elevated him to position that sometimes threatens to eclipse individual identity beneath layers of obligation and expectation that accumulate like sediment around anyone who occupies seats of ultimate authority. The evening rituals they share unfold with natural rhythm that owes nothing to protocol or prescribed routine. Simple domestic activities that reconnect him to satisfaction found in tasks performed for their own sake, rather than because duty demands their completion. The tea that she prepares carries within its careful ceremony appreciation for moments that belong entirely to them, time that cannot be claimed by urgent matters of state or interrupted by crisis that requires immediate royal attention and decision. Their conversations flow through subjects that range from immediate concerns about kingdom management to memories of paths they walked together during years, when their love developed without interference from responsibilities that now claim so much of his attention and energy. She listens to his struggles with the isolation that accompanies ultimate decision-making authority, offering perspective that emerges from her own understanding of how leadership changes those who accept its burdens, yet somehow preserves essential aspects of character that make such acceptance worthwhile. The wisdom she brings to their partnership draws from centuries of observing how power affects those who wield it, experience that helps her recognize when he needs encouragement to trust instincts shaped by years of ranging, and when circumstances call for patience with processes that unfold according to time frames longer than individual preference might choose. Her counsel emerges through gentle questions that guide him towards solutions, rather than direct advice that might feel like additional pressure, when he already carries too much weight of others' expectations. The physical comfort she provides through simple presence beside him, during hours when sleep comes slowly to minds preoccupied with problems that resist easy resolution, creates foundation of peace that sustains him through difficulties that might otherwise prove overwhelming. Her breathing settles into rhythm that teaches his own body how to release tensions accumulated through days spent maintaining posture appropriate for ceremonies and audiences that require constant awareness of how royal bearing affects those who observe it. The love they share serves as anchor that prevents the drift toward cynicism or despair that threatens anyone who deals daily with human weakness and political maneuvering, reminding him through countless small gestures that beauty persists despite corruption, that individual hearts remain capable of generous response, even when larger systems seem designed to reward selfishness and manipulation. Her faith in his capacity to serve noble purposes provides foundation that enables him to continue choosing hope when evidence might suggest that darker assessments of human nature deserve greater credence. In her arms, he finds the particular form of home that exists independently of place or circumstance, sanctuary that travels wherever love establishes its presence. The satisfaction that emerges from decisions whose benefits will unfold across decades, rather than seasons, teaches Aragorn about forms of accomplishment that his ranging years never revealed. Projects that require vision sustained through periods, when progress seems imperceptible yet accumulates, through patient attention to details that individually appear insignificant, but collectively transform entire systems of how people live and work together. The schools that he establishes in districts where literacy has remained rare luxury will educate children whose contributions to Gondor's welfare cannot be predicted yet, whose expanded possibilities will shape the kingdom's future in ways that military victories could never achieve. The trade agreements that he negotiates with distant kingdoms create networks of mutual benefit that will strengthen over time as merchants develop relationships based on trust earned through reliable fulfillment of obligations. Commerce that builds peace more effectively than any treaty signed by rulers whose successors might interpret written words differently. These economic connections weave threads of interdependence that make conflict increasingly costly while expanding opportunities for prosperity that reaches beyond noble families to touch lives of ordinary citizens whose welfare provides the ultimate measure of successful governance. The infrastructure projects that consume vast resources during his early years as king represent investments in foundations that will support growth for generations. Aqueducts and roads and harbors that enable commerce and communication while providing employment for workers whose skills develop through participation in construction that serves purposes larger than immediate payment. The stone bridges that span rivers, where ferries once created bottlenecks, will carry traffic long after he has passed from memory. Monuments to vision that looked beyond present convenience toward future needs that wise planning can anticipate and address. The legal reforms that he implements through careful consultation with scholars and judges create framework for justice that will evolve according to changing circumstances while preserving principles that protect individual rights against arbitrary exercise of power. Laws that serve fairness rather than expedience, yet remain flexible enough to address situations that current wisdom cannot foresee. These improvements in how disputes are resolved and crimes are punished will prevent countless injustices while teaching citizens to trust institutions that operate according to consistent standards rather than personal whim or political advantage. The agricultural innovations that his advisors develop through systematic observation of farming practices throughout the kingdom will improve yields, while protecting soil from degradation that short-sighted techniques might cause. Methods that increase abundance while ensuring that future generations will inherit land, capable of sustaining even larger populations. The experimental orchards and test fields that require years to demonstrate their value represent faith in techniques that serve long-term stewardship rather than immediate harvest, wisdom that his ranger experience taught him to value over quick solutions that create larger problems through failure to consider broader consequences. The cultural institutions that he fosters through support for artists and scholars create treasury of beauty and knowledge that will enrich lives in ways that cannot be measured through economic statistics, yet contribute to the kind of flourishing that makes prosperity meaningful, rather than merely comfortable. The libraries and theaters, workshops and academies that he establishes provide spaces where human creativity can explore possibilities that serve joy rather than necessity, pursuits that elevate consciousness beyond survival concerns toward recognition of potential that emerges when basic needs are secure and attention can turn toward higher aspirations. The diplomatic relationships that he cultivates with neighboring realms establish patterns of cooperation that will serve peace through periods. When individual rulers change, but mutual respect continues to guide interactions between peoples whose prosperity depends on ability to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare. These alliances based on shared commitment to justice rather than temporary advantage create stability that allows all participants to invest energy in building rather than defending, growth rather than mere preservation of what already exists. The year's turning brings Aragorn to his chamber window, where stars wheel overhead in patterns that once guided his wandering steps, but now illuminate territory that has become truly home through conscious choice to remain rather than roam. Kingdom that is transformed from burden inherited through bloodline into calling embraced through understanding of how individual service can contribute to purposes larger than any personal ambition or desire for adventure beyond familiar borders. The reflection that gazes back at him from glass shows face marked by months of learning that leadership emerges through patient attention to to countless small decisions rather than dramatic gestures that capture attention but fade quickly, without foundation built through daily commitment to others' welfare. The crown that rests upon its cushion beside his bed no longer feels like foreign weight imposed by circumstance beyond his control, but like tool perfectly suited for work that draws upon every skill his ranging years developed while teaching new forms of strength that emerge only through willingness to set aside personal preference in favor of collective need. The gold and jewels that once seemed excessive display of wealth have revealed themselves as symbols that inspire hope in hearts that require visible evidence of stability and continuity, beauty that speaks to aspirations towards civilization, that transcends mere survival to encompass flourishing, that makes existence meaningful rather than simply bearable. The kingdom that sleeps peacefully beyond his windows represents more than territory defended through military might, or governed through assertion of royal prerogative, but community of souls whose individual dreams combine into shared vision of what becomes possible when power serves love rather than demanding submission, when authority flows toward protection rather than exploitation of those who lack means to resist or escape oppression. Each citizen who rests secure tonight does so because countless decisions throughout the past year prioritized their welfare over easier choices that might have served immediate convenience while creating future problems. The satisfaction that fills his heart as he prepares for sleep emerges, not from accomplishments that will earn recognition in histories written about his reign, but from growing certainty that his presence in this place serves purposes that extend far beyond individual legacy toward contribution to patterns of justice and mercy that will outlive any particular monarch. Yet it depends on each generation's willingness to choose service over self-interest, wisdom over expedience, patience over the immediate gratification that destroys tomorrow's possibilities for sake of today's comfort. The bed that receives him feels exactly right for someone whose wandering has found its proper destination. Rest earned through work that builds rather than destroys, choices that heal rather than wound, leadership that enables others to discover their own capacity for goodness, rather than merely compelling obedience through fear or manipulation. The pillow that cradles his head holds no weight of decisions that compromise conscience or betray trust placed in hands that have learned to wield power as carefully as he once handled sword and bow, with respect for consequences that extend far beyond immediate target. The dreams that will visit him tonight carry visions not of distant roads calling him away from responsibility, but of children growing into adults who will inherit kingdom shaped by wisdom rather than whim. Prosperity built on foundations strong enough to support whatever challenges future generations must face, with courage learned from examples set during years when leadership chose the harder path that serves long-term flourishing over short-term advantage. Tonight, as you rest in growing quiet, let yourself find peace in this understanding that the greatest adventures often lead not toward distant treasure, but toward recognition of how individual gifts can serve purposes larger than personal ambition. That true satisfaction comes through building something worthwhile rather than merely experiencing pleasure, and that the deepest rest flows through hearts that have discovered their proper place in creation's larger symphony. Sleep peacefully, knowing that service willingly offered transforms burden into blessing. That leadership, guided by love, creates legacy more precious than any crown. And that home means the place where your presence serves life's most generous purposes.